Air France, she says. No other airline. My body must fly to Paris via Air France. Air France. I write as quickly as I can. And they must first go to City Hall to verify the Bernot family name. Her voice continues through the oxygen mask, direct and dignified, if a bit staccato for its breathlessness. The anesthesiologist is hovering over Adrienne Bernot with the endotracheal tube and the ventilator, gasping at a rate of 35 breaths per minute, with her wispy neck muscles straining like reeds in a summer storm. There isn't much time. No ceremony before the interment, she continues in her bird-like voice, just a burial at Rue de la Colonnade. I dutifully transcribe her words as the resident physician silences the insistent alarm on the overhead monitor. The anesthesiologist loads his syringe with succinylcholine. Adrienne Bernot doesn't look 62 years old. She has that mythical, ageless beauty that French women seem to possess. Her innate charm deceptively triumphant over her stage 3B lung cancer. Please give my paintings to Pierre Montagnier, she says, adjusting the headband that holds her reddish-black hair in place. And the linens to my neighbor, Sarah Pelnick, if she would like them. And you, she says, looking over their oxygen mask at the intern, who's drawing yet another tube of blood. It is time for you to start paying me for all that blood I'm giving you. The anesthesiologist draws up 10 cc's of fentanyl. With no way to be unobtrusive in this crowded and cramped room, the medical student shrinks himself further inside his white lab coat. I read aloud the words I have transcribed, and she is satisfied. With delicate, long-nailed fingers, from which many an elegant cigarette has dangled, she signs her name in trembling letters. I add mine as the attending physician directly below. The clerk from accounts payable stamps her notary in brusque black ink next to our signatures. She looks directly at me. 7 days, she says, swallowing air in small bites. Une semaine. 7 days of intubation and treatment is all Adrienne Bernot wants. If I do not get better, she puffs, take it out. 7 days to figure out whether the spidery lattice work that has progressed so rapidly on a chest X-ray is an infection or if it is a suffocating return of her cancer. In 7 days, we could have a reasonable chance of getting an infection under control. But if a biopsy confirms cancer, the 7th day will likely be her last. We stand in a silent semicircle around her bed, and she glances at each of us. What are you all so nervous about, mes amis? We go forward, no? The anesthesiologist flexes the laryngoscope in the air to check that it is functioning properly, and it snaps open with a decisive metallic click. I hold her hand and ask if she has any further questions. She shakes her head no. On rounds last week, I distributed an article from a medical journal entitled The Good Death. It talked about how terminally ill patients express a consistent desire to give back to society, and so I take a deep breath. We train young doctors here, I say, nodding to the medical student, resident, and intern, gathered around the bedside in their crisp white coats with pockets bulging with the medical paraphernalia. Is there anything you'd like to share with us that would help us all become better doctors? She looks around the room, her finely honed cheeks puffing inside the mask. No, I have no complaints, she says. You've all been my guardian angels. Heavy swallows and 4 gazes plummet to the ground. Is there anything else we can get you, I ask. A clean gown, s'il vous plaît. I've made a mess of this one. 4 sighs, a request we can actually fulfill. The respiratory monitor clangs again to one of dropping oxygen saturation, and 4 arms rush to silence it. And you promise me, she says, that I sleep through the whole thing, that I do not wake up for the entire week? I nod, hoping that her low blood pressure won't preclude the use of strong sedatives. The anesthesiologist raises his eyes to the overhead monitor and then looks to me, parallel lines of wrinkles tensing on his forehead. 3 loaded syringes are curled in one hand, and the plastic endotracheal tube is clasped in the other. Are you ready? I ask, still holding her hand. Oui, she says. Her eyes dart over the edge of the mask, locking us in a tight, airless circle. "See you later," I say, in the breezy tone I might use with a friend parting ways on the street, and then silently demand to God that we had better uncover garden variety microorganisms in her lungs and not malignant cells. "We'll see you at the other end," I say, hoping that I'm not lying. I nod to the anesthesiologist as he discharges the first syringe. Adrienne B's sculpted lips with their carefully applied lipstick soften as the sedative whispers through her veins. Then her fingers suddenly tighten around mine in a vice-like grip, her nails digging into my palm. I know that it's just the depolarizing effects of the succinylcholine on her muscles, but it feels like a panicked plea for life. And I want to shout, "No, don't do it." I want to grab the endotracheal tube from the anesthesiologist's hand to block what may be the beginning of the end. I want to lay my body across hers and protest the silencing of her words. I want to keep her voice with us in this moment, in this room, in this world. But I know that it can't hold out. Her flailing respiratory muscles and besotted lungs can no longer support this voice that is so much the embodiment of Adrienne B. It will disappear with or without our mechanical intervention. 7 days on the machine is our only chance. The anesthesiologist lowers the head of the bed and slides the tube down her throat. Her lipstick is smeared in the process. The machine takes over, and all at once, Adrienne B's body is limp and sallow, like every other body lying in wait in the ICU. One by one, I unlock her tensed fingers from mine. The blunt silence is punctuated only by the heaving of the ventilator. 4 pairs of eyes catch each other and then shudder away in disparate directions. There is the sudden, icy awareness that we might be the possessors of Adrienne B's final words. We might be the guardians of her last smile, her final joke, her ultimate bon mot. We file out from the room, medical student, intern, resident, attending physician, our hands dangling awkward and useless, our tears threatening to give way. Like an invisible chain, the silent prayer snakes from one to the next, that maybe Adrienne B will indeed speak again, and that we will not be required to carry this burden to our final days. 7 days we wait. 7 days we hold her words. Waiting and holding. These are 2 of the burdens of medicine that I think are the most powerful challenges we face. Waiting and holding. And these aren't words you'll find in the Index of Harrison's or in the Index Medicus, if anyone even uses that anymore. Contrary to the stereotype, doctors do not lack for emotions. The medical student is embarrassed to ask the patient to change for a physical exam, to undress. The intern is furious at the cocaine addict who's refusing the CAT scan and she won't go home yet again. The senior attending is nervous on rounds. He's a bit rusty with his inpatient skills, and maybe the team will catch wind of that. Emotions punctuate all the actions of the characters in this drama, and yet we're often not aware of how they affect us and how they trickle down. We walk fast, we talk fast, especially if we come from New York. We eat fast, we talk fast, we write fast, often all at the same time. And I think because we're too afraid to stop and see where those emotions will redound within us. The 7 days that Adrienne B forced us to stop and wait were a terrifying and awe-inspiring time. And when I got home that night, there were so many things I could have done. My soul felt shattered. It felt literally in pieces, and I knew that I had to put them back together because I had to go back to the ICU the next morning. And I remember thinking there were many things I could have done to deal with all of that. I could have had a drink. I could have gone to the gym. I could have, eaten all the ice cream in the freezer. I could have screamed. I could have cried. I could have kicked the dog, which I would never do. But instead, I wrote a letter. I wrote an email to a friend, the kind that starts, "You will just not believe what happened to me today." And I told the story. Of course, I didn't realize it was a story at the time. I just told her what happened that day, and I sent off the email, and it was pre-instant messaging, and I didn't get a response, not that I needed a response, but I needed to tell the story. And one of the stories I use with my students a lot is Anton Chekhov's short story called Misery. And the epigraph is, "To whom shall I tell my grief?" And if you don't know the story, it's really precious and worthwhile. Iona is a cab driver. He drives a horse-drawn sleigh, and he's doing the night shift, Christmas time in Siberia. And he's driving his sleigh back and forth in the snow-covered drifts near Vladivostok, taking his drunk passengers from one party to the next. And for each customer, he tries to initiate a conversation. His young son has died that week, and he wants to tell them. But of course, everyone is busy. They're involved in which New Year's and Christmas party. They're drinking their vodka. They're laughing. No one takes him up on this gambit. And he drives the whole night, and not one person has engaged his conversation. And then his shift finishes, and he brings the sleigh back to the sleigh parking lot, and he brings his horse back to the stable, takes off the saddle, and he's brushing the horse, and he tells the story to the horse. And of course, the horse can't answer or talk back, but it was enough to have listened, to have told the story. And when we think about what we do in our jobs, in all areas of healthcare, much of what we do is to bear witness, to hear the stories. Many of our patient stories can't be solved by the skills that we have. Many of their pains and aches relate to their socioeconomic status, their immigration status, psychological things, the philandering husband, the good-for-nothing children, raising the grandchildren because the children are died of AIDS or drug addicted. All these things we cannot help, and we know these are the root or certainly exacerbating factors in our patients' pains, but we often can't do much about them. And for many people, this can burn them out. But I try to remind us all that the bearing witness, right, the being there to hear our patients' stories is often much of what we need to do, just to bear witness. The American Board of Internal Medicine, to which I am boarded, every 10 years requires its internists to recertify. And I just did it last year, recertified, and I can test you that it was a miserable and caustic experience. And even more so because just as I was studying, they announced that they were going to do away with the every 10-year exam and have an every year open book, but they were not grandfathering in anyone else. So we still had to take that test. And the first time I took my boards, I was fresh out of residency, I was single, I was unemployed, I had endless time to study and quite a bit of familiarity with filling in number 2 pencils into little circles. My second and third time around, I had 3 children, I had a job, I was writing, I was traveling, I had lots of commitments, and by now a healthy fear of 10-hour standardized tests. And so I would bring my review books to work every day to try and, because I had no place else, I couldn't study at home, obviously, too much chaos. And I was always trying to cram in a few facts about sideroblastic anemia between patients and the renal tubular acidosis type 1, type 2, type 4, and why wasn't there a type 3? And, we always have one cohort of colleagues all in the same position. We're always lamenting how hard it is to get these facts to stick inside of our heads. And you remember the old thermometers that would break and the mercury goes around? You try to grab it and you can't grab them. Well, that's what these facts felt like. There were so many of them, and I couldn't get them to solidify and park in one, cerebral dry ride. And I think we lament that it's so hard to remember all these facts. But no one ever has trouble remembering their most powerful patient stories. Right? You can, go up to the most senior professor emeritus on service and ask him or her to relate a case from internship, and they will with an almost frightening clarity. They can tell you every detail. And most of us who are in some kind of healthcare profession, we can trace our entire careers in an arc of stories, from our first day in school, from our first patient up to the present, because these stories are what stay with us. I think we're internally wired for that. Now, if I ask you, and I won't point on anyone to embarrass you, but if one of you in the back row could tell me the positive predictive value of the D-dimer versus ultrasound for diagnosing a DVT, nobody, some of you can remember. I can't remember that. Thank goodness I have my iPhone, right? But if I asked you to tell me about your patient who died of a pulmonary embolus, a disease you could have prevented, that you remember. Right? We can remember every detail, right, of the emergency call from the nurses, the panicked blood gases, the emergency EKGs, the late night call to the family, the begging for the chance to rewind the tape and do it over, the pit in our stomach when we realized that our patient died of something that we could have prevented, right? We never forget that. That is the power of narrative, right? These stories hold in us in a way that the facts about DVTs and PEs simply do not. One thing I've noticed in the last few years in medical journals is the rising popularity of literary sections, right? Lots of medical journals now have literary sections, poems, essays, occasionally short fiction, and plenty of my colleagues will confess they always turn first to see what poem is in JAMA before they see, which bedrock of care has been smashed by the latest clinical mega trial. And I think there's no accident in that, because most of us went into medicine to take care of patients, not quality-adjusted life years, or Markov cost analyses, or hospitals. They call us hospitalists in America, which is a term that rubs me the wrong way. And I think this says a lot, first of all, about organized medicine, that I think within that stony bureaucracy, there's a flutter of a heartbeat in there. But I think it says even more about nurses and doctors, because these stories and poems have much more in common with what we actually do in our day, how we live our lives, than the most, powerfully powered randomized clinical controlled trial, no matter how clinically relevant the data are, because stories are what our patients bring to us, and that's what we bring to them. I'm assuming we're all, good and loyal followers of evidence-based medicine, and one of the concepts in evidence-based medicine is the NNT, the number needed to treat. How many patients do you need to treat with a statin to prevent one heart attack or stroke? Is it 30? Is it 50? Is it 100? Is it 10,000? These are important numbers. And as much as I'm a strong proponent of evidence-based medicine, in some ways, it's a bit irrelevant, because the practice of medicine comes down to an N of one. That single patient looking you in the eye and says, "Doc, will I be okay?" For that patient, right, it doesn't matter what was in the journal, or how big the trial was, or how powerfully powered it was, or how pedigreed its authors were. Right? For that patient, it's only that individual story that matters. And I think for us as well as clinicians, in the practice of medicine, although we read the journals to know our information, it's the story that makes a difference in our day-to-day work. There's that famous description of pornography, right? You know it when you see it. And I think we often say the same thing about good doctors, right? We kind of know it when we see it, and we know the ones who are not good, the ones we'd never send our parents to, our children to, right? And we know those doctors with wonderful, brilliant clinical minds, but when they get to the bedside, they're endlessly blundering with the patient. And I'm both horrified and intrigued by why so many brilliant doctors are so terrible at the bedside, writing endless notes about the non-compliant patient, about Hispanic hysterical syndrome, one of the terms at Bellevue, total body dolor, TBD, and all these terms that come up in a derogatory way. And I would submit that I think it's the power of the story, of the anecdote, is that what helps us translate great scientific intellect into the possibility of healing, right? It's not instead of our medicine, but our medicine can only work if we can get it to our patient, right? We can prescribe a medication, but if they don't take it, right, it doesn't have any effect. And how we interact with our patient, how we become part of that story, is how we help our patients, receive the medical care that they need. Now, earlier someone mentioned that August is the turnover day in the UK. For us in the States, it's July, right? July 1st onward, never go to a hospital, right? New medical students, new interns, and consequently, it's very hard. We can't take vacation in July. Nobody wants to cover in July, so I've often gotten stuck attending on the wards in July. So one July, a couple of years ago, we admitted a very cranky, very obese woman with a pelvic mass. And her clinic doctors had been trying to work this up as an outpatient, but for a variety of reasons, city bureaucracy, difficult patients, they couldn't get it done, in a timely manner. So they admit to medicine, you figure it out. And this was a classic, quote, difficult patient, right? Always loud, always complaining, demanding, always wanting to be turned, needing 4 people to turn her, always unhappy with the nurses, the phlebotomists, the social workers, the housekeepers, everything. And as a consequence, people, the team and the staff tread very gingerly and quite infrequently into the patient's room. And I have no doubt that a lot of her complaints were probably valid, but the sheer repetition just made it so difficult for the staff to be in her room too often. Unfortunately, the mass turned out to represent metastatic disease, and so the intern and I went in to tell her as in empathic terms as possible, and in fact, she and her husband were quite calm and more polite than they'd been the whole week. A few hours later, the intern was paged because the patient was having chest pain. So the intern's wheeling EKG machine, and of course I trail behind July. I don't quite trust her clinical skills yet. We walk in the room, and there's a semicircle of people around the bed. The patients are one of 5 siblings, are all there, plus spouses. And like stone judges, they're sitting with crossed arms and stern expressions. We walk in, and suddenly the mouths open and the verbiage begins to fly. Just a torrent, like a torrent of locusts. Suddenly the intern and I were enveloped in the full rainbow spectrum of defense mechanisms. Right? There was the husband saying, criticizing the clinic docs for not getting the diagnosis, the sister angry at us for telling the patient the diagnosis, the aunt wanting us to transfer her, right up the road to Memorial Sloan Kettering to get a better diagnosis and treatment, and the cousins, jotting down our names and serial numbers, talking about his friend, the lawyer, from whom we would be hearing. Now, the intern and I were suddenly enveloped like in this drama, and at that moment I thought, Meryl Streep has it easy, right? She's got a script. She's good and all, but she's got a script. We have to do it on the spot, right? And although, say, the intern remained kind of a set piece because she couldn't unfreeze her arms the entire time. 20 minutes of this went by, felt like 24 hours. But I realized that we were now characters in this drama. Whether we buy into this, story nonsense or not, we were in this drama. And I think when we talk to our students and our interns and even our colleagues, we appreciate that people are overworked and underpaid and tired and want to, get out of the hospital as quickly as possible. I think we do them and ourselves a disservice by not recognizing the role of stories in this. And I think that our colleagues and I think we fully expect to be taking care of ill patients, but I don't think we expect to be characters in this drama. And that drama could be, at its peak because the protagonist is acutely ill in the hospital. We come prepared to be doctors and nurses, but we end up as pawns in ancient family disputes, as defenders of an often indefensible medical system. All in one morning of family, of medical rounds. And again, our best actors don't have to do this on the spot, when they're making rounds, but I think we do. And to at least recognize the potency of these stories, whether we buy into it or not, I think is critical. Each day in our lives, whether on the wards, in the ICU, in the clinic, on rounds, we accumulate stories. And these stories that, our patients tell us, stories that we hear, often very different things, stories we participate in, myths and legends that circulate the wards as slyly and as efficaciously as MRSA, rumors that we hear, and these stories build up. And every so often we're gripped by a desire to tell the story, right? Like Iona, right? And it doesn't matter, in essence, to whom. It could be to your horse in a quiet, damp stable with just the placid equine mastications. It could be to our spouse, to our student, to a fellow traveler in the subway. But we have to tell these stories. It's a compulsion to tell these stories. And sometimes we write these stories. And, writing about our patients is becoming a more popular thing. And there's, certain ethics about writing about patients. And this comes up a lot. I mean, obviously, our first duty to our patients is not as fodder for good dramatic writing, but taking care of them. And there's privacy issues. And so, when I talk to students about writing, I obviously we should get permission from our patients before we write about them. Often, my first 2 books, I wrote way in the, many years later, and often didn't have contact with the patients, or they had passed away, they were deceased. And in that case, I try to think about the motivation for writing. Is it just a good story, or is there some lesson that we want to teach and can get out of it? And if the patient should come across it, would they find it a respectful rendering? And that's very important. Now, obviously, that's a subjective thing, but they would feel like it was doing a service, it wasn't harmful to them, didn't portray them in a negative light. And that certainly depends, on the situation. Most of our patients at Bellevue are immigrants, working poor, many undocumented, uninsured, but we do have a small subset of the upper middle class uninsured artists and writers, right? It was becoming less once we had Obamacare. It's going back up. But there's always a few. And I had this one patient some years ago, a poet living in the East Village. He ran a poetry slam, doesn't pay very much, and he was always broke. And I was always spotting him medical care. He couldn't afford even the very basic clinic fee, so I was doing things over the phone. And he, was open. I knew every, STD and genital wart this guy ever had. He was not shy. And then one day he calls me and says, gosh, I have the worst headache of my life. The light's bothering my eyes. I feel like crap. Could you prescribe something for me? And of course, I'm thinking could have meningitis. And I said to him, listen, you may have nothing, but you could have meningitis. You have to come in. We have to do an LP, a spinal tap. No, I can't come in. I don't have any money. I can't come in. I said, it's really important. I am not going to sleep tonight unless you come in for an evaluation. No. It's fine. Okay, listen. You come in the clinic back door during my lunch hour. Lunch hour is a little bit of an exaggeration, my lunch a minute, and let me at least lay eyes on you, examine you, okay? And we won't even register you, just so I can see you, so I can be sure that you're not about to die. So he comes in, we sneak him around the back, and he looks pretty awful. He's got dark sunglasses on, his conjunctiva injected, his neck is a little stiff, no fever, and I say, listen, and he's telling me he just got back from Rome, and he's got this terrible headache, and I said, you have to get a spinal tap. You have to go to the ED, the emergency department. You just have to do it, And so I sent him down. Finished my day. I got a call that night from the attending in the ED, and she said, "Well, the LP was negative, but I need to tell you, he's been doing cocaine." I thought, that little shit. He didn't tell me that. Like, if I knew he was doing cocaine, well, that's why he has a bad headache and his eyes are red, and he can't like. Look, wait a second. How's he affording cocaine? Wait a second. He just said he was in Rome, and I'm spotting him free care. I was livid. He lied to me. And I'm telling you, this guy has not been shy about all his, multiple affairs and things that he does. And I decided, some weeks later, I needed to write about this, the experience of being lied to by a patient. That was a powerful thing. And I also thought that would be a very instructive topic to talk about, I think, with other doctors, that, being lied to is that we have this assumption of trust. And I felt so betrayed by him. And so I wrote the story. But I realized, first of all, this is a guy who reads the New York Times, right? He could come across it. But if you read it, and it's not to say that you can do it if they don't speak English and don't read the paper, but if he read it, I think he would be hurt. Right? I think he would feel bad. And so for that reason, the story stays under the bed. So I tell my students, you can write about anyone you want, but whether you publish it is a different story. Right? The telling of the story is often what's important. The publishing of it, that's something separate. And I think social media adds a new and sometimes bizarre twist with the ability, with not enough space for nuance and the potential for instant, exponential amplification. That's a toxic brew. And so I absolutely, warn people to shy away from that, really completely, because it's so easy to cross a line and the consequences are so large. I mean, you publish in a literary journal whose, subscriber base is probably smaller than the audience in this room, that's one thing. You put it out on Twitter and it's amplified and you can't take it back. That's a whole other thing. And so my rule of thumb is just to keep all of that, off that, because of the, lack of space for nuance. And one of the things when you write a whole story is you have a chance to be contextual, to give it the context, the frame of reference. And that can often make an enormous difference as to how you're portraying the patient, and not to underestimate the power of how we pull together the story. And I think back again to Iona. He didn't publicize this anywhere. He just needed to tell the story. And sometimes that's all we need. So I've been talking a little bit about story, about narrative, and I think it's pretty intuitive to see why narrative resonates in medicine, because the narrative's like a case history. We have a protagonist, we have conflict, we have action, sometimes resolution, and so it fits in with what we're primed for. But what about poetry? Why is poetry relevant in medicine, and why do medical journals publish poetry? I mean, JAMA, the American Medical Association's journal, to publish a poem, they could be putting a Viagra ad right in that same space, and that ad costs more than $15,000. So here's the American Medical Association voluntarily declining $15,000 to publish a poem, right? It's pretty subversive, don't you think? And I think part of the reason that poetry is so important is simply the language. we write and speak in the most dull language conceivable. I mean, pull a medical journal out of your bag, open to a random page and put a finger, and just try to read that out loud. I mean, it sticks in your throat like the grits they used to serve in our hospital cafeteria, which was all, somehow this New York City cafeteria was staffed by all Southern Americans, and we had grits and oxtail soup, which I'm not even sure what's in that, fried chicken and watermelon on every Wednesday. Long gone is the musicality of murmurs that Sir William Osler described, right? Today, only peer-reviewed, double-blind language may be used. So I think, again, part of the reason that poetry is so meaningful for people in medicine is just the use of language. And I kind of make the analogy, if you ever do long-distance driving, you pull over the side of the road to a little diner for some lunch, and usually the food is really cheap in price and in quality instead of the greasy, $9.95 buffet. And you can have that, or you can get like one penny-sized dark chocolate truffle, just going from, vast amounts of difficult to digest language to one little bit of deliciousness. And, the words, given the cacophony of medicine, right? We walk fast, talk fast, eat fast, blah, 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 blah. And then when you get to poetry, right? Poetry allows you to sort of drip deliriously into one spot, into like a pinpoint of pleasure, a morsel of clarity. And a good poem teases out the tiny strand of emotion, holds it up to the light, and rotates it slowly to catch all the nuances and all the warts. Right? It gives us this chance to be highly specific and get rid of all the chaos around us and just home into that one beautiful word or turn of a phrase. But the second reason that poetry is important, I think even the more important reason, is its use of metaphor. Because poetry is all about metaphor. But in medicine, our patients speak to us in metaphor. And when our patients come to us with elbow pain and back pain and neck pain and 1,000 other complaints that they have, complaints I'll put in quotes, they're always speaking to us in metaphor. It's our job to unpack the metaphor. And if we just simply focus on the concrete, the manifest content of the words and ignore what's below it, we will miss out on the many layers of meaning. We'll probably miss the diagnosis too. And so you can see sort of the origin of medical error coming right in there. And our patients will leave us for a doctor with a more sophisticated understanding. And when we discuss metaphor, metaphor makes you use two different parts of your brains, things that often aren't pulled together. And when I listen to my students and interns present, I worry that they've sort of calcified various parts of their brain. When they admit the patient with chest pain and rule out an MI, it's, admit the patient, enzymes, EKG, cardiology consult, a stress test, and, it's like the bagel store, 2 poppy, 2 sesame, 2 whole wheat, right down the line. And it's but they may actually never consider, could it be amyloidosis? What if it was emphysema, something else, Chagas disease? Patients come off the boat to our hospital. And the rigidity of clinical thinking, again, is an enormous source of medical error. But when you interpret poetry and the metaphors, you have to take this part of thinking and that part of thinking. And you've got to stretch that muscle that hasn't been used in a while and pull that in. So that flexibility of thinking that metaphor forces us to do is an important clinical tool in medicine, that we have to have that ability to think beyond what seems like just the concrete manifest content. Poetry is of value because it makes us use the metaphor. And I would just want to share with you one of my favorite poets. His name is John Stone. He was a cardiologist and poet from Emory University in Atlanta. He passed away a few years ago. And he wrote a commencement poem for a class of graduating medical students who probably had no idea how lucky they were. And the name of the poem is Gaudeamus Igitur. For those Latin folks out there, it's Therefore Let Us Rejoice. It's a 4-page poem. And I went through a period of a couple of years where I tried to give a poem with a day to my students. And I initially tried to bribe them with, junk food. I've discovered that medical humanities requires a lot of bribery. But I realized quickly that my team, hadn't seen a green item of food in weeks. And so I began to pick up fruit from local fruit stands. So I would put out poem of the day, fruit of the day, please take one of each sign. And that's what I did. But at the end of the month, I would do Gaudeamus Igitur. It's a 4-page poem. And for that, I had to get to the double chocolate truffle cake, really go all out, and the big, couple quarts of milk. And there's many beautiful, quotes there, but I'll just leave you with one. And John Stone writes, "For you will learn to see most acutely out of the corner of your eye, to hear best with your inner ear." I'll also say it to you one more time. "For you will learn to see most acutely out of the corner of your eye, to hear best with your inner ear." And these are the ways that poets view the world. And I think that we as clinicians, we can become better clinicians if we learn a bit from the poets. And so I think the impulse to tell a story is innate in the human race. But I think that we in the medical professions are unusually primed to resonate with stories because that's what our patients bring to us. For those of you married to accountants, how much drama do your spouses bring home at the end of the day? And it's really fixed cost derivatives. Although I have to amend that. My husband, the computer programmer in our life, at one point, in that point, we 2008 worked for Lehman Brothers. And so the weekend that Lehman Brothers brought down the entire world financial system, that was a story to bring home at the end of the day. But other than that, it is not that interesting. And so, when I think about, how automated and high-tech medicine's become, I thrill to that. I love technology. I'm not a Luddite at all. I wouldn't want to practice medicine without, all of our wonderful tools. But no matter how automated, wireless, and efficient, medicine becomes, or QA'd and QI'd it becomes, I really truly believe that medicine boils down to one doctor, or one nurse, or one caregiver with one patient in one room with one story. Thank you very much.
That was great, Danielle. Thank you very much. For me, you have a great ability to paint pictures with your words, and it's fantastic. The bit about the cafeteria brought me right back to St. James's Hospital, the old St. James Hospital in Dublin, where I used to share my on-call meals with a reasonably decent-sized cohort of cockroaches. So, it's the power of you were saying there, and really convincing us, and those of us who don't need convincing, but nonetheless were very convincing about the power of narrative and the power of the story. This figure of 80% of the diagnosis can be made on the patient's history alone. I just wonder if we were better listeners, could we up that percentage, or am I getting a bit evidence-based in that question?
Well,
I apologize.
I truly think so. I mean, one thing I often pose to, my students is that, we can practice medicine, when there's a power outage, right? It's a little harder, but we can do that, when the lights go out or the hurricane. We can practice medicine when we travel to a developing country that doesn't have tools. But it's very hard to practice medicine when you think back when you've admitted a comatose patient, right? When you can't talk with a patient, it is much harder, right? We do a reasonably fine job when the lights are out and the power's down and the computer's down. But when we can't talk with the patient, it's really gone. And I think the doctor-patient conversation is the single most powerful tool that we have. And it's also quite a sophisticated technology. If you think about all of our other tools in medicine, which, again, I love, but most of them do one thing in one way. But our communication with our patients is very flexible. When you think about the number of diagnoses you can pluck out, the treatments you can render, the analyses you can elaborate, not to mention the connection you make, it's a very sophisticated technology. So I do think that we can make more diagnoses. And you probably know the data. Is it okay if I ramble on? That doctors cut off patients in, 8 to 10 seconds. And when I talk about that with lay audiences, they think, oh, how rude you guys are. And I try to explain we're not trying to be rude. We're just trying to get the answer. So the patient says, it hurts here. Well, we jump right in. When does it start? When does it stop? What makes it better? What makes it worse? Right? To get that diagnosis to help our patient. But if the patient had a second thing to say, like, I think I had a stroke last week, we're going to miss that. And again, medical error begins right there. So I truly believe if we're better communicators, we can up that statistic.
Which begs the question from the book, and you describe it so well. You decided to do your own bit of experimenting. You brought in the stopwatch. And things were going pretty well for the first 2 or 3 patients, and then this incredibly loquacious female patient came in, and it was 4 minutes and 7 seconds before you were able to to click
But it
the
felt like
stopwatch.
4 hours and 7 seconds.
Yeah. But I'm just thinking from the point of view of those of us who are at a clinical coalface, right? And let's say we're operating to a 10 to 15 minute consultation time. Whatever way you cut it, 4 minutes, and we won't leave out the 7 seconds, is a lot of that, a big chunk of that. So I think for me, I feel almost a sense of fear when that happens. And could you talk to us about how do we deal with
Sure.
that? And
So, and the patient that you mentioned was, one of my patients with we call the polypositive review of systems. Everything hurts. But I find that if I let patients talk, most patients will stop within a minute. They really will come to a natural end. And a minute of full frontal listening, right? Eyes on the patient, no computers, actually quite a bit. And most patients will get at what they have to say. And then I'll say to the patient, I don't want to miss what you're saying. Would you mind if I take notes while you speak? And then I turn to the computer and I've included and they understand. But that 1 minute is, actually quite efficient. And with that patient who took 4 minutes the first time, all of our subsequent visits were much easier. So when I talk to my students about being efficient, and we're a very busy clinic, we have 500,000 outpatient visits per year in our facility. And so being efficient is key. To use the counterintuitive strategy of letting the patient talk uninterrupted for the first minute. You will be more efficient because you won't miss what the patient needs to tell you. They won't have the hand on the doorknob with the extra 16 things they want to say, and you'll be more accurate. So, right, they can't all talk for 20 minutes or an hour, but even just 1 minute and then say, okay, I'm going to take notes now, is that okay, is often a way to combine the best of both.
Another thing I think that might be worth sharing is that you talk about rediscovering the joy of physical examination and the joy therein of moving over to the exam couch and having a dialogue where the computer literally can't interrupt because it's over there and you and the patient are here. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
I think for years people have been predicting the demise of the physical exam. And for a number of reasons, we can get an echo, we can get a CT, an MRI pretty easily. And I suspect that our clinical skills probably aren't as good as our predecessors. But I've found in the last few years that the physical exam has really had a resurgence. Yes, and it's helpful for making a diagnosis, and I won't ever say no to that. But now, because the computer has really taken over our history, that the physical exam is the only place that you can talk with the patient without technology interfering. You're talking and touching. And there are precious few minutes left of just talking and touching in medicine and, of course, in the real world at large. And often, that's when the patient will say what's really on their mind. Whether they're reminded of the cough while you listen to their lungs, or that's the moment they can talk about the domestic violence or the eating disorder or the sexual symptoms that they're too ashamed to talk about over the formality of the desk and the computer. So I find the physical exam is where we've now rescued, the story that the patient can bring to you.
Okay. I'm going to ask you now about empathy. Empathy, for so many years, was undeniably a good thing. There's been, as you're probably aware, a couple of books and articles, major articles, challenging that. So the question I have is, can, and perhaps even more importantly, should it be taught to medical students and doctors in training?
Well, people often talk about, those awful doctors, like they're the worst people. But I think that the crop coming in as students are excellent. I think the people who used to go to medicine for prestige and money, they've long since left. It is much easier to get an MBA in the States than to suffer through 10 years of training So I think in some ways that's been, a salutary development because we've weeded those folks out. So who goes into medicine now? People who want to be there. So I think that's not the problem. I don't think we necessarily need to teach the empathy. We just have to preserve it. I mean, even, a 3-year-old is naturally empathetic and can recognize someone else's suffering. And I think all of our students who come in can do that too. We just summarily stamp it out of them, as they go through their training. So our job as educators is to find a way to preserve that and also to model it. And I think that's, our tendency in medicine, we want to teach something is we have a PowerPoint presentation or we have a 1 to 7 Likert scale or some core competency they have to achieve. But how we really teach is when they get to witness that. So when you bring the team to the bedside to do an end-of-life care discussion, or what I often do on the wards on the first day, ask the team, who's the worst patient on service? Because there's always a worst, right? The drug addict, the one demanding pain meds. Let's go talk with that patient. or the patient screaming in the waiting room. Like, instead of calling hospital police, let's go out there as a team. And I think when you can demonstrate to the team how, with a little bit of empathy, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist, but to help talk down an angry patient, that's a miracle, right? Without having to use handcuffs or Haldol. And I think when you see that in action as a student, you get why it's important. You don't need to have a multiple choice test on why empathy is important.
Thank you. So guys, the good news is you look at your list of patients, you pick the heart-sinkiest of them, and you promote them to number one to come in to see you. Now, I'm going to open it up to questions, if that's okay. So, if we could have a microphone just here, please. Just hang on for one take, yeah.
Did the French lady die in your book?
You have to read the book. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. Okay.
I just wanted to say really thank you so much for that lovely talk, and actually all the speakers today. It's been so relevant to clinicians, I think, on the front line, particularly when we've been talking about burnout and clinician fatigue. And I reference your book quite a lot with medical students. I teach undergraduates very early on about science and society and the social context of medicine. And I also use one of your Atlantic articles where you talk about the bi-directional nature of the doctor-patient relationship, which I find really, really helpful. And it's always nice to give them something that isn't, medical journal sort of language. It's very accessible. I just wonder if you were, putting together a reading list now for junior staff or for medical students, what are your top tips for including narrative medicine, I suppose, for undergraduate education?
So I guess the first tip is food. Right? That's always bribery essence, but food is the most efficient bribery. I keep things short, so I don't prescribe a huge novel. I'd love them all to read Cutting for Stone, but maybe they won't all do that. But so short stories. Actually, I'll use this moment, if you don't mind, to mention the Bellevue Literary Review. I know we sign financial disclosures for conflicts of interest, but literary journals don't make any money, so there's no conflict of interest for me to shamelessly stump for our literary magazine. And so we publish poetry, fiction, nonfiction about health and healing. And one of my guiding principles as editor is accessibility. We do nothing that I think the average person couldn't read. So I use a lot of contemporary work from the BLR. We also, on our website, publish free study guides. So there are discussion questions that you can use on themes, aging and death and infectious disease and environmentalism. So using contemporary work and selected older works as well. But also to make dedicated time. I try not to squeeze it in when it's something else is, pressing. So those are really my tips. But I think the biggest part is to have someone high up, promote that as well. So when the dean or the chair says, "Oh, we think it's important that you all write an essay by the end of the rotation," well then, okay, then we all write an essay, and then now we're all writing. So buy-in at the top is very important, and obviously you can't pick your higher ups, but finding that at least one champion somewhere in the dean's office, there probably is someone, and that's I think where the biggest help is.
Okay, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question about patients' consent for writing about them, because it's something I've really wrestled with as well, and I was very interested by what you said about that. Because if you take a really extreme view of patient consent and patient confidentiality and our duty to respect those, we shouldn't write anything about any patient if there's any risk at all that they could be identified to themselves or to their family members, for example, not just to a man or woman on the street. And to some degree, I feel as though all doctors who write should be absolute about that. But if that were the case, then it would be very difficult for any of us to write. And I know that from talking to other doctors who write, people address that in different ways. So, for example, sometimes people might describe a story where the medicine of the story it's a composite, where the medicine of one patient's story is superimposed on the demographics of another patient, and so in the end there's a sort of amalgam which couldn't be identifiable even to patients themselves. And I just wondered what you thought about that, because it's something that really troubles me as a doctor who writes, and I would be mortified if I ever inadvertently revealed a character, a patient, to themselves, even if they were the only person in the world who recognised themselves.
Or read about yourself in your gynecologist memoir, right?
Yeah, exactly. So how do you
So it's a
address
great
that?
question, and I think it depends who you ask. So Oliver Sacks would say the patient's story is your story too. You share the story. Rita Sharon at Columbia, incorporates consent as a formal process and gives it to the patients to read. So I think obviously we should get consent when we can. Sometimes it's not possible, so certainly changing identifying characteristics. Or sometimes I may choose just to use the bare bones of it. That'll be very, the middle-aged gentleman with diabetes. That is not character specific. Or you write fiction, right? There's nothing wrong with writing a novel, and you can pick and choose what you want. The composite is a little dicey in the nonfiction world because we are doing facts. And I think it's fair though to distinguish journalism, where you want to be scrupulous to every thing, versus when you're writing an essay where if the hair was black or blonde, it is a little less important. I wrote a piece for the New York Times about why doctors don't take sick days, and I opened with an anecdote of when I was a resident. I was really sick to my stomach, and I grabbed some cherry Maalox off the ER, and I downed it on the way up to the call room and promptly puked it all up. And then the fact checker said, well, it actually didn't come in cherry flavor. It only comes in lime or mint. And I don't remember, but they actually went and checked what flavors Maalox comes into. So for them, as a journal, as a newspaper, that mattered. But I think if I write it for a literary magazine, and again, not that I don't want to be anything less than faithful to the facts. I think some of those facts we can comfortably change, so to get the essence. But consent when you can, or pull it back so it's not identifiable, or that's not the key issue in it. But you're right, it's we do have to respect the privacy, and some patient stories you just don't publish for that reason.
Rachel, can I say to you that, and it's very interesting, I'm a doctor turned journalist, you're a journalist turned doctor. I am absolutely petrified, as you are, by this dilemma. And I think it's very interesting, and it's just only going through my head at the moment, and maybe we could talk about it, is you would think the journalism part would make it so much easier because of the training in journalism, but it doesn't. It actually makes it much, much harder. Almost to the point of phobic for me. It's just, I tried and I can't go there. It's interesting. Sorry, this gentleman up here was next, and then I have you here in my sights. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just to, it's more comments than actual questions. It's going back to your points about the history and the examination from the history point of view. I had a young 17-year-old young woman recently with difficulties in speaking at all. So I had to take it. It was psychiatric history, but I had to take it, and the only way I could do it was she nodded or shook her head or shrugged her shoulders, and that was a particularly interesting way. It took about 2 hours to actually get a history of her, but I was able to do it, so it's interesting. And the second thing is just involved with physical examination. On a societal level, we've moved so far away from touch, because touch, unfortunately, has become, inverted commas, bad in my view, and particularly with children. So I think as doctors, we're in a particularly important role that we are actually able to almost legally touch people sometimes. And I absolutely agree with you that when touch in itself brings things out, and sometimes it's the history that it brings out, but it's vital that we do it. And again, I'm in psychiatry. Unfortunately, we don't examine patients enough. In fact, we don't have the facilities sometimes. And actually, it's vital that we do that. So it's just comments to support what you're saying. So
I think once we touch, it is intimate. Not romantically intimate, but it's intimate nonetheless, and every intimacy changes the dynamics. And I think you were right that when patients are in that experience, it's a very different type of communication, if respectfully and obviously gently done.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Yeah, it's not really a question, it's just a kind of comment. But I just want to say it was a great day. I enjoyed all the speakers. Everyone did a really wonderful job. the idea of advocating for a patient sometimes can overlap that thing of their privacy, where you want to highlight something that's wrong in the medical system, but it might actually identify a patient. I know of a case that happened last year where in one of the major hospitals in this country, a patient was kept waiting unduly long on a trolley, and the consultant who was watching this said some things that made the patient identifiable, and that was used against the consultant in order to try to silence him. And I think that's another problem with the confidentiality thing. It is being used against us as a way of advocating for our patients, and we need to find a way through that. It's a bit of a minefield, I think. And
it is a minefield, and particularly in the U.S. with the HIPAA laws are so broadly drawn that you really could be sued for any of this, and we're a very litigious society over there. But I guess, to obtain consent, if at all possible, or change the details. That's all I can say.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. There's time for one more, yeah. I think I recognize who that is. Yes, it is. Hi. Yeah. Barbara, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was such an inspirational talk. I really, really enjoyed it. And it connected to some of the work that I've been involved in. I've been involved in a programme called Schwartz Rounds, which has just come to Ireland, and worked at the Royal Free for 8 years, listening to stories and preparing the stories. And so much of what you said resonated. And I was thinking about both telling stories, hearing stories, and writing. That's all connected. That the other thing as well is that they change our relationship to ourselves. You're reflecting on the relationship with patients, but there's something about creating a space between us and our professional role, and a space to look and understand. And I just wonder whether that thought resonates with you.
Yes, I think that, our patient stories become our stories. And so I think, and the idea that we are characters in that drama. Abraham Verghese wrote a beautiful article for the Annals of Internal Medicine some years back, what doctors can learn from novelists. And I think we're part of that story. And I will just add, I left, if you're interested in hearing about, medical humanities, I left a sign-up sheet upstairs. If we do have an email list of medical humanities, non-commercial, but please, no Dr. Scrawl. Nice penmanship would be appreciated. But there's lots of interesting stories out there that we try to share that relate to the many aspects of, of medicine, music, art, literature, and I think we all need a little bit of balm, in our days.
Okay, we'll cut it there. Listen, thank you very, very much. It's so lovely to talk to somebody who just is so steeped in narrative, and so it's been a huge treat for me, and I'm sure it's been a huge treat for the audience. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.